I have the privilege of introducing Helen Chen, but virtually I think everybody here, I think everybody in the ePortfolio world knows Helen Chen. But her day job is a research scientist in the Designing Education Lab in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Stanford. I want to talk about 3 things about Helen, because you can read her bio, you can go to LinkedIn, you can find all that stuff. But one is, Helen is truly a good example of someone who is liberally educated, because she has a PhD in communications, she has a minor in psychology, and she's working in her day job in engineering and doing design. And so she's a walking advertisement for the kind of education that all of our students need. And ePortfolio is one of the ways that we can actually help accomplish that for more of our students than we have in the past. The second thing is, indeed, the fact that she has been one of the driving forces around ePortfolio being what it is today, and actually the possibility of it being something more than it is today. She is the co-founder of EPAC, which is the ePortfolio Community of Practice. She's the founding member of the AAEEBL and sits on the board. And she's the co-executive editor of the International Journal of ePortfolio. And so there's this set of the skeleton of what we do and how we practice what we're doing. And she has been instrumental from the beginning in developing those things that allow us to keep this work going. And the third thing I want to talk about is, I think, perhaps the most important, at least it was the most important for me, is that she is she's oriented the field of ePortfolio practice from a technology initiative to a focus on how we think about our work around teaching and learning. The folio thinking that is associated, almost any time you hear folio thinking, Helen Chen, folio thinking. She's been relentless, but very nice about it. So really nice. That's the other. Helen is really a genuinely nice person. She's fun to be with. She's bright. She's funny. She's serious. But it was that focus again that I did mention earlier, the relationship among multiple factors and dimensions of the work. It is about everything has context. And it's about those relationships, how you shape them, how you live them, how you instantiate them. And not just within yourself, but also your relationship to the technology, your relationship to your colleagues, your relationship to your students, and to others. And so that has been, for me at least, the biggest gift in my thinking and work around ePortfolios and teaching and learning more generally, and how I try to interact with people, is that a sense of folio thinking. It's not about me, and it's not about them. It's about us, because it is an interaction, it is a relationship. And so I am really delighted to turn this over to Helen Chen. Please join me in welcoming.
So thank you, Terry, for that kind introduction. It's really my honor to be able to have this opportunity to give this year's annual Batson lecture. What I did was kind of went through my emails, and I had first exchanged emails with Trent Batson in 2001 when a mutual friend introduced us, because we were both doing work around eFolios, and he was actually the Director of Information and Instructional Technology Services at the University of Rhode Island at the time. We subsequently worked together on initiatives related to the open source portfolio initiative, part of Sakai, and then also did joint presentations and webinars, and of course then collaborated on the launch of AAEEBL. You'll be interested in knowing that even though we joke around about AAEEBL's acronym as having the acronym with the most number of vowels in the name, but prior sort of like titles that were sort of floated were Next Generation ePortfolio, and Web to ePortfolio as possible sort of names. So I don't know, maybe ABLE is actually okay. Now, Trent's vision prior to settling on ABLE really, I think is really sort of embedded in many of the goals and values. And as we enter into our 10th year, we really continue to be grateful for Trent's vision as well as his leadership. And my talk today really plans to continue the arc that was established by my friend and colleague and collaborator, Emeritus Professor John Idelson from Cal State Monterey Bay, and what he talked about at the AAC&U ePortfolio Forum. What I'd like to do today is actually do a little bit of looking back, but also do some looking forward in terms of what are the potential opportunities around how we can continue this momentum of ePortfolio transformation. So to begin this talk, I'd like to start with this quote from Stuart Brand, who's a writer and author, and he talks about how this present moment used to be the unimaginable future. Where we are today, actually for me, it's been about almost 20 years of working in the area of portfolios. If you had asked me in 2002 if I thought I'd still be doing work with ePortfolios, I probably would have shook my head because I wasn't sure if it was just going to be another educational technology fad. Why is it that ePortfolios still continue to resonate as a paradigm and also have expanded to lots of different domains and areas, from assessment, technology, as well as pedagogy? So I think what's interesting, of course, is that interest in ePortfolios remains strong, because for a multitude of reasons. Again, assessment, learning, showcase, as well as for many different stakeholders. I think the number of stakeholders has grown, faculty, students, programs, and institutions. I think all of this is very significant and perhaps was unimaginable back in 2002. Now, when I look back and think about what's changed and think about the people and the organizations that have been part of this community, there are really probably too many to list, but one person does come to mind, and that would be Dr. Helen Barrett. Has anyone familiar with Dr. Helen Barrett? So there was no question that Helen Barrett is certainly the grandmother of ePortfolios. And I think when John first called her that, she wasn't too thrilled about it. But now it's actually in her bio. And I think many of us were really impressed because she had the domain name, not only electronicportfolios.org, but also electronicportfolios.com. Now, she was on the faculty, she's of course retired now, is living in Seattle, but she was on the faculty in the College of Education at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and worked primarily on portfolios in K-12 and teacher education. Her website is still very rich with resources, metaphors for a portfolio. There was a time where at that time there weren't that many portfolio platforms, so whenever a new one would come out, she would actually recreate her portfolio in each platform and provide some insights into how they were different and how they were similar. Now, this particular figure that was published in 2009 is one that is probably one of the earliest to really begin to look at the difference between ePortfolio process and ePortfolio product. Really trying to just sort of differentiation. This differentiation, of course, is a theme that's certainly come up, during our discussions here today. And, especially as we think about intentionality, audience, as well as purpose for the portfolios that students create. Now, I think another aspect, of course, has been the thought leadership around ePortfolios. And I think, back when we started, there was much of the work, I think the electronic portfolios and Electronic Portfolios 2.0 were edited collections compiled and edited by Darren Cambridge, Barbara Cambridge, as well as Kathleen Yancey. Kathy Yancey, of course, remains a leader in the field and continues to publish, is quite prolific and so on, with books on reflection, especially convening various folks from around the country during her time at Clemson University. John Zubizarreta at Columbia College, wrote this book on learning portfolio. And then I think we also drew a lot from some of the work that came out of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, the course portfolio, teaching portfolio, which is now in its 4th edition, but also the research that's come before us on reflection. Jennifer Moon, Donald Schoen, the Kolb work by Kolb and other kinds of researchers and so on. And then also, when you think about where those traditions of research already exist, teacher education with with portfolio in hand, with some really great chapters by Lee Shulman, who's an emeritus professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. And then Ali Jafari and his colleague Catherine Kaufman have compiled this edited collection of handbook on research on portfolios, which also, again, begins to identify who are some of the players, who's thinking about this work. Moving forward, of course, Darren went on to publish a really great book on ePortfolios for lifelong learning and assessment. My collaboration with Tracy as well as John on documenting with portfolios. And then, this actually begins to highlight some of the projects and initiatives. So obviously the Connect to Learning project out of LaGuardia and the books that came out of that. New sort of edited collections such as this one, which maybe folks may not necessarily be familiar with, this ePortfolio performance support systems, which is actually available as a free download online. Candace's and Judy's book on leveraging the portfolio for integrated learning. This is Kathy Yancey's latest book, ePortfolio as a curriculum. And then, the Field Guide to ePortfolio, which was a collaboration between AAC&U and ABLE. So you can see the scholarship in this area continues to grow. We continue to leverage, research traditions, trying to bring in literature from other areas. Even just here at the conference, we've heard about, adaptive expertise, transfer of learning, some of the work that comes out of the learning sciences, interest in, self-efficacy, the work of Bandura, and I think that will continue to sort of emerge as we sort of create, our own sort of research traditions and develop our own theories and frameworks. How do we continue to build upon the work that already exists? Now, of course, when I think about the people, it's not just the people, but it's also the organizations. And for some of us, you might be a one-person shop on your own campus. And where do you find, that's right. So where do you find your colleagues? Where are your people and everything? And I think, for many of us, it has been organizations such as like EPAC, ABLE. There were quite a few of us that were part of that international coalition of ePortfolio research, making that annual journey to Clemson, sometimes getting lost on the way to Clemson, as that was my and Candace's experience and so on, but multiple cohorts that ranged anywhere from 5 to 10 institutions, beginning to, from the UK, focusing on various themes, whether it's academic affairs and student affairs, ePortfolios and assessment, that it really is to the credit of Barbara and Darren Cambridge, as well as Kathy Yancey, in providing a structure and an opportunity for schools to come together to support each other and really advance and establish, give the field a strong foundation. Now, again, it's not just work that's happening here in the United States. In Europe, the ePortfolio, the Center for Recording and Achievement out of the UK, and of course, as we saw yesterday with the view from Australia, a very strong presence in ePortfolios Australia. Early on, it was in terms of higher education institutions, it was really, many of us met at the American Association of Higher Education meetings. That eventually went away, and of course, AAC&U has played such a strong leadership role, thanks to Terry, as well as Eddie and other colleagues and so on, in really providing that kind of framework, and that opportunity with the AAC&U ePortfolio each year to come to portfolio forum each year to be able to come together, meet, and also meet with other colleagues in higher education. So, and I think in terms of publication outlets, other kinds of journals, the Pearl, of course, which has been mentioned, is an archive of peer-reviewed ePortfolio research that is available at AAC&U that begins to kind of keep tabs on sort of where the field is emerging, and of course the International Journal of ePortfolio, as well as the ABLE ePortfolio Review as other kinds of outlets. Now, one thing I do want to mention, of course, is sort of how how the technology has changed as well. So, when we think about in 2002, there, it has been sort of these, 1990s type of websites and so on. I remember Judy was especially excited one time where there was like, she could do a website with like flashing colors and turning things and stuff like that, And so of course now, we, our students and I think all of us have become much more savvy. We expect that there will be, whatever portfolio you put together, that you can look at it on a phone, on a tablet, on a computer, and so on, that responsive design. that, some people want that sort of long scroll, the beautiful templates, so much higher sort of, design sensibilities. And so our students have those expectations, we have those expectations as well. And I think the tools, the platforms have begun to sort of develop and, and expand and become more refined as a result. However, we of course are also facing challenges, challenges on our campuses due to political, financial, budgetary reasons, change in leadership, organizational change, lots of advocates, cultural changes, other pressing priorities, infrastructure and support for faculty development, student development. And one thing, of course, we have seen is actually some consolidation in the ePortfolio vendor market. We still, of course, have, open source options such as Mahara, OSP, the open source portfolio is no longer. So there are other opportunities, and then, again, companies have either gone away, bought each other and things like that. So those, I think, are considerations because, with something like Celio, a company that, again, that I had just discovered a couple weeks ago that is no longer around, how does that relate to some of the things that we've been talking about with respect to digital ethics? When we are asking our students to invest and put things into companies that we've developed relationships with, and there isn't a way that company, for whatever reason, closes, what happens to all of that information? For many years, of course, we've asked our students to, hey, create LinkedIn profiles, because that's the currency of the profession and so on. The fact that LinkedIn is now owned by Microsoft, is that a concern, kind of thing? So these are, again, sort of some of the concerns, considerations, issues, questions we want to explore further. We don't want to shy away from this, but this is sort of the reality, especially in the day of working with third-party vendors who are certainly can be fantastic partners. But again, what are these other kinds of considerations? All right, so now I want to kind of shift gears and look forward and really touch upon three areas which I feel have great promise for the ongoing transformation of portfolios. Amelia and Natasha, I think, touched upon these issues as well, and I want to actually bring in a slightly different perspective related to actual sort of practices and prototypes and so on. Of all the things that have changed, the things that have sort of, I think, stayed the same, these are the definitions that I still use. I used, about 2002, I had these definitions, I still use them today. The idea of how do we define what a portfolio is, a purposeful selection of artifacts together with reflections that represent some aspect of the student's learning. In this case, we're talking about students, but the owner could be a program, an institution, for other kinds of purposes like accreditation. I will say that one early project that was led by AAEEBL was a project initiative that was focused on urban institutional portfolios, developing institutional portfolios for accreditation purposes, and Portland State, IUPI had created those kinds of examples. The culture of folio thinking, providing structured opportunities for students to not only reflect, but think about how their experiences come together. That remains something that really speaks to sort of the culture that we're trying to bring, not just sort of bringing them the technology. And in that regard, when you think about our ePortfolio values, they remain today to be learner-centered, focusing on reflection and metacognition, and increasingly more and more integrative and holistic, really helping students to make those connections, whether it's between curricular and co-curricular experiences, or even within a particular course, trying to understand the different concepts and how they come together. So with that, I think, this is something that there was no question at the beginning that, the E in ePortfolio stood for electronic. Ashley Kehoe, who was formerly at Dartmouth, now she's actually working, I think, for a startup in Chicago. She was also at the Loyola University of Chicago prior to going to Dartmouth. Wrote this great piece that I always cite around, what that E in ePortfolio could stand for. That if it's, if electronic or digital is assumed, is there an opportunity to think about the E as experience, evidence, engagement, And then, of course, the other ideas that we've started talking about at the conference around empowerment, empowering students to take greater ownership, of their portfolios, the interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as, excellence. That maybe kind of falls into the same tradition of portfolios as we've seen all along, trying to put, best work forward. But of course, still perhaps having different kinds of portfolios where you can show that growth over time and to be able to include, work that might be for purposes of advising and mentoring. Now, the first of the three topics or areas I'd like to talk about is actually, the transformation of records, academic records, via intersections with ePortfolios. And so, especially now, if we think about the whole lifelong, life-wide learning trajectory, what does that look like? The idea that all of us are, will continue to be learners for the rest of our lives. And if we take this as sort of the context, then how might we think about ourselves as well as our students as agents of integration? That the students themselves, in terms of preparing them for what's ahead, the question of how do students transfer knowledge is a very important one because it really relates to the larger aspects of the larger issue of the educational experience. And Rebecca Nowacek in her book, explores this issue of transfer by asking what in an educational setting engages students to become these agents of integration. How can individuals actively working to perceive as well as convey effectively to others the connections that they make? So I really like that sort of framing of who students are. And if we're thinking about a lifelong learning career, they're not, they cannot necessarily rely just on the institutional records to be able to represent the breadth of their experience. So here, my former registrar, Tom Black, who's now at the registrar at Johns Hopkins, had talked about the transcript, the traditional academic transcript, which is that official record of your education once you graduate from an institution, as being the record of everything that the student has forgotten. I don't know how many of you guys have looked at your transcript from your undergraduate, career recently and so on. There are probably things that you didn't remember that you actually took. And so every time he presents on this, or even when I present on this, there's a bit of a chuckle because that is that official record. That's all that's left. Sure, you might have gotten a diploma, you put it in a frame, hang on the wall of your office and so on, but the official record is the transcript. But what does it really say about your experience, your education, what was truly memorable and meaningful to you? So the opportunity that I explored with Tom is this intersection of where do the ePortfolios and transcripts as the official record intersect? What might be included, in each, and how did they come together? Now, we could sort of have this, but of course, where is the student, in all this, and really kind of creating that record of the experience, not the education that was just delivered to them, but the one that they lived and experienced. And so, I think portfolios obviously have a role in playing, in serving there. Now, AAC&U and in some of their public opinion research of employers, we've talked certainly about this, that applied and project-based learning experiences such as internships and apprentice experiences really give college grads an edge, with employer audience and so on. So you look at internships, projects in community with people with different backgrounds and cultures, multiple courses with significant writing assignments and so on, study abroad, service learning, all of those kinds of high impact practices. We also know from the National Association of Colleges and Employers, some of those key attributes that employers seek on a resume and so on. Right now, these are not things that, employer would get from an academic transcript and so on. And this is where I think, our partnership with our colleagues in career services, career education is really key to this. Now, I want to show you a few examples of how we've, from students in terms of how they are creating that record via their ePortfolios. And again, this really speaks to some of the need now to really think about multimedia artifacts, as a way to be able to represent. So, in this case, Barbara, who's an undergraduate student, junior at Stanford in management science and engineering, kind of created a sort of timeline, of her, her significant experiences, where she was born, and she's half Honduran and half Colombian. She, participated in math Olympics. She was also a tap dancer, and so on. And then, did a study abroad in Oxford and did some research in archaeology, and then, where she is today. Another example is this idea of, when we talk about, for example, often when we talk with students, so you may go into meet with an employer for an interview, and they might have in front of them, your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your transcript, let's say, your cover letter, and so on. What else, if you put an ePortfolio in there, what else does it say about you that isn't captured in those other documents and so on? In this case, Sandra, who's was international relations, did a lot of work, very interested in human rights. You created a sort of, in some ways, sort of like an infographic about her personal values, around research, teaching, community, human rights, as well as, communication psychology as a way to be able to represent that. And of course, this is not something that you would see, on a LinkedIn profile. The third example is one that I pulled because about that question that came up earlier about the scenario that Gail posed around NDA, non-disclosure agreements. What could be represented? And in this case, Greg was an intern at Frontier Airlines, and he actually wasn't able to post his actual example of work, but he did kind of create this case study and the language here, and maybe this could be something to think about, as you're working with your students. Due to the sensitive nature of the work in corporate finance, I've opted to write a case study to represent one of the projects I worked on during this internship. So that in and of itself, coming up with a case study that is sort of based on, it also is a demonstration of skills, the skills that he gained. It's not the actual work that it's not just, I'm just going to upload this paper, but it really demonstrates what his understanding, not only what was important about the work, but also how it might appeal to his target audience for his portfolio, a particular employer who might, because he's looking for a job in finance. So that would be another example of how students are really creating these records for themselves. The second area is this idea of transformation of identity via storytelling. And I think we're seeing more and more of this. I mean, this interest in the storytelling sort of approach to things. And, whether we see it in business, I think at the AAC&U annual meeting, there was a lot of sort of discussion about storytelling models and so on. And of course, here in this community, we talk a little bit about how portfolios can help students, tell their own story. There's actually quite a bit of research on storytelling, a lot of it coming from, ideas around marketing and branding. Jennifer Ocker is a professor at the Graduate School of Business, and she says that when data and stories are used together, they resonate with audiences both intellectually and emotionally, and as a result, they're more impactful, they're more personal, and more memorable. And so this is actually a video on YouTube that you can look up, and everything is just a short video, but helpful to take a look at. I think, Natasha in some of her other work talks about evidence-based storytelling. How do you use data in effective ways, to be able to communicate message? And I think this is also where, as we think about, who our audiences are, who our stakeholders are. I work a lot with engineers, and so what they are persuaded by are numbers, tables and statistics and that kind of thing. As I think about, as I try to build portfolio sort of interest on my campus, understanding who I'm talking to and what would resonate with them, whether it's, data about the impact of ePortfolios or student testimonials, or a combination of both and everything. And then today, it's also more than just, here's the article that I wrote, or here's the research paper. It might have to be a one-page, infographic, an executive summary, or just, or a portfolio, a website of something, or short video. So I think we also, as ePortfolio advocates, need to think about the different ways in which we communicate and how we actually, reach the people that we're trying to, convince or persuade and so on in different kinds of media. Because we've heard it like, no one reads anymore and everything. So to, all of us, I mean, sure, I could send you the article or the research and so on. You're just going to add that to that growing stack of articles that you mean to get around to, or open up yet another tab on your browser. So those would be things I would encourage you to consider. Now, much of my work in this area, really thinking about this idea of transformation of identity, is actually from two classes that I co-teach, and some of you heard a little bit about this yesterday, for helping undergraduate and graduate students create professional portfolios. And the common sort of storytelling approach that we take in that class is this idea of thinking about your story now, purpose and audience being very, very critical. Some of them are thinking about employer audiences. Others are just, our first-year students and just thinking about sort of their role sort of in the university. Some are thinking about going to graduate school. Others are just going straight to industry. And then really focusing there then on the story building plots, evidence and architecture, and then building the ePortfolio. I will say that students come into the class thinking, it's been on my list of things to do to build this portfolio, and tell me what platform to use and so on. But really, where we want to start then, where we spend a good a third of the class is really just this first part, really helping to help them understand their experiences, their values, their skills, and then actually stepping them through some storytelling strategies. Now, I will say that for these two classes, what has been really critical for us is a strong partnership with career education. Because so much of what career coaches do is this process. Only they do it in sort of, individual sort of sometimes one-off meetings or workshops and so on. But it's the same idea. How do you understand yourself, understand who you are and what you want, and then, again, think about what are the tools in which to help you sort of convey that message, whether it's a resume or a cover letter or CV and so on. In this case, we're using the portfolio, but it's really the same process and so on. And they really have been invaluable partners to us, in these two courses. So I wanted to just sort of briefly show you some of the, storytelling strategies, but what this sort of image speaks to is that where we see portfolios fitting in to this broader digital ecosystem. That given all the places that we are online, and this of course is Candace and Melissa's refers to their presentation around digital citizenship and so on, that we are all in these various places. And again, where does a portfolio fit relative to, again, as I mentioned, those other kinds of representations that a student might find themselves in, or or if an employer Googles them, what might rise to the top. So in terms of thinking about these digital story strategies and how we see this intersecting with the portfolios and really giving students an opportunity to practice how they might communicate and share who they are, I'm going to go ahead and just go through 4. These are just, and give you 4 examples. I think most people are familiar with the elevator pitch, and the 6-word story is pretty much a 6-word story. So the story strategy one is address and directions, and this is actually one that was developed by my colleague, Dr. Sheetal Patel, who I co-teach the grad course with, and so on. So in this case, Paul's portfolio is here, but you see here, he says, I'm a computer science student at Stanford. That's the address. And the directions in terms of how to get there, I'm interested in designing resilient, efficient, and secure systems to solve practical problems, and so on. And that provides some directions of how do I get to, some of this work. And this could be sort of his goal and things like that. And the portfolio then is organized around that story right on the front page. The second story strategy, and this is one that I really like, is this idea of external empathy and internal story. And again, I give credit to Sheetal for developing these strategies. So for graduate students, the idea of so I study 18th century French literature and then, proceed to go on to very detailed jargon and so on, that may not resonate. And that, especially for some of our more technically oriented, our students from technical fields and so on. So how do we help them, develop an accessible way to kind of represent their research in many cases? So in this case, the external empathy piece is do you remember the last time your cell phone battery lasted you through this week? If you're a smartphone user like I am, you probably don't. Similar problems arise with batteries in electric cars, causing a need to replace them every few years. So that's sort of as someone, have you ever felt this way? Can you relate? I think most of us can relate to this particular experience and so on. The internal story then, my research as a chemistry graduate student focuses on the processes that make your battery lose capacity over time and the reason it eventually stops working altogether. Now you can imagine this chemistry grad student could have gone in and right into sort of the technical aspects of, lithium batteries or I don't even know what whatever the technical terms are. But the idea of, external empathy, internal story provides that point of connection, before diving into sort of the details of his research. And I think this is helpful, and we may, sometimes we have to make the case to the grad students that it's not dumbing it down, because even if you, you are going into, you've applied for an academic position, and there's a search committee not everyone in the chemistry department, let's say, is going to understand your specific area of research. Or, especially if it's a multidisciplinary, department, there are going to be people from all over. So I think still being able to provide a point of connection can be very helpful. And of course, then if you're going out to the public and everything, which, let's say the non-science public, there's a great interest in science communication, this could be another way to be able to help make, the research more accessible. Now, I will say that in general, I think our students are interested in that. They're not interested in just producing research that's necessarily just going to sit on a shelf. There is interest in that social impact idea and everything, and so these storytelling strategies have multiple uses, not only for helping, let's say, to get an academic position or position in industry, but also making research more accessible to the public. The third strategy is just like 3 words or adjectives. And again, 3 words that you want to represent you. And those words then become, sort of, part of the architecture of the portfolio. So in this case, Michael Reddick, he's a PhD student in chemical engineering, identifies as a scholar, an advocate, as well as a leader. Now, in the process of creating his portfolio, again, he does very, very in-depth scientific research, with cells and chemical engineering things. But what I appreciate about Michael is that he also had a very strong interest in, social justice issues, and really recognized that for himself as an African-American man doing research at the highest level in the science field, that, he really wanted to take the advantage of the, he saw his role as being a role model, did quite a bit of advocacy work with the Black Engineering Graduate Student Association, volunteered with local high school students and so on, and really wanted to make sure that part of his work was represented, and really took the opportunity with his portfolio to be able to highlight those kinds of experiences. We had interviewed, Pablo and I had interviewed, Michael and other students from LaGuardia and Stanford, for a presentation that we gave at the AAC&U ePortfolio Forum. And one thing that was striking about what Michael said was, when someone clicks on your portfolio link, they defer to you. However you want to tell your story, what you want to emphasize, that's up to you to decide. And I think, Alexi was sharing her experience earlier about how, going onto LinkedIn, everyone says, you got to create a LinkedIn profile and so on, which she did, but she didn't like the standardized sort of format, and just having all those sort of set categories and so on. And so from her LinkedIn profile, she points to her portfolio, that if you want to learn more about me, go to my portfolio instead. And so there are no expectations in terms of, what these portfolios are supposed to look like, in terms of especially these kinds of showcase external facing portfolios. And then again, the idea that, whoever's clicking, when they choose to click on that link, they defer to you in terms of how you want to tell that story, what you want to emphasize, and what you choose to value. And so I think that, again, is an opportunity. Now, the last strategy that I'm just going to discuss here, or I think there's one more after this, is this idea of the idea, mission, vision statement. And this, of course, we see on a lot of commercial websites, Nike and so on. But in this case, Anita was a graduate student, master's student in the Graduate School of Education. I believe the purpose of education is not only to improve academic performance, but also to encompass social and emotional learning. And so in many ways, this is the thesis, right? This is the thesis statement for the portfolio. And then, of course, to dive in deeper is to look at the evidence that supports it. It's not necessarily everything that she's ever done, but this is why we do the inventory of experiences before, to be able to allow students to be able to select and curate, specific experiences that would back this up. Now, lastly, I guess I did include this example. There's she told, tell your story in 6 words. So her 6-word story is, I create stories to impact people. She has a background in advertising and marketing. It's been a great privilege working with her and collaborating with her on this work. What I think is evident here, and again, now if we think about, again, that digital ecosystem, is that the stories that are created, that messaging, can then be then used and populate other kinds of platforms, that you can take that story, once you have it, you can then include it on your LinkedIn profile. You can include it in other sort of areas as well. And the idea that, we hope that at the end, like the students, that they embody it themselves, right? That even without the portfolio there, and again, we saw that with the student panel with Lucas and Alexi and so on, that, there was no portfolio there. But is there some value in that portfolio process? There's multiple stories there, and I said this yesterday as well. There's a story that's in the portfolio itself. There's a story that you tell when you're with the portfolio and you're directing people to various aspects and so on. But there's also the story that you tell when you don't have the portfolio there. Then you're in an elevator, you're at a cocktail party, you're on the bus or on the subway and so on, and someone says, "Tell me about yourself." That you're able to tell that story. And I have to give attribution for this idea from my colleague Ermila, because there's also the idea that there's the stories that other people tell about you. As you put this out there, what are the other stories that people tell about you when, let's say, the recruiter goes to the hiring manager and says, "Hey, this is someone you really should take a closer look at." But I think ultimately it is that we want the students to embody it in themselves. It should be here and everything. And the portfolio is really the mechanism by which they can practice this, and they can also get feedback along the way. Okay, so the third area is this idea of transformation of ePortfolio experiences. And this is actually via a designer's mindset. This is probably less so focused on the students, more focused on all of us here in the room as designers of experiences for students and so on. And so this actually speaks to some of my work with the Hassel-Plattner Institute of Design, also known as the D School, around some of their work around sort of design thinking. And so, this process of, is one that I think is, commonly seen of empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing as a sort of an iterative process and so on. However, the opportunity, I think what is valuable out of this work around design thinking is actually not so much what it is, but really the skills, and how can we, as designers of experiences for ePortfolio experiences for students, leverage this mindset of design, in our own work, in order to really, create something that is truly, something that is different and innovative, and something not just like the same old, same old. So one idea that I gained from a recent workshop that I had gone to over in the D School is that they have been focusing on moving beyond, just the tangible steps, what you saw in those like hexagons and so on, into a set of design abilities, the intangibles of design. And the process that they are engaging in is similar to how we go about articulating the learning outcomes and goals for our students. Like, what do we want students to be able to do when they leave our classes? It's more than just being able to just simply, write an essay, complete a problem set, and so on. So when you think about our intangibles, they are things like creative thinking, problem solving, leadership, and oral and written communication. Now, one intangible that the D School has been exploring that I think is particularly relevant to our work is this idea of how to navigate ambiguity. And ambiguity, of course, defined here as the ability to hold two different ideas, at once. And to describe things in more than one way. So the dualities, the multiplicities, and action. And of course, for many of us, ambiguity is not a state that we want to be in. That's not our sort of a natural, state. We want things to be resolved as quickly as possible. We will have a bias towards certainty, and of course that's completely natural. However, we also know that this future has never been more uncertain, for many, many reasons. And if you think specifically for our students, it's no longer this, singular path, through higher education or even through their lives and so on, that, that they have to learn how to be. I think maybe we all need to be fluid and improvisational and so on. And so how can we help them become more flexible and ready to pivot as they consider, what major they want to pursue, what career they want to pursue, what their plans in the future might be. Now, for many designers, this idea of ambiguity is an idea to be embraced, because it means, there's a certain amount of courage that's involved, to be able to think about multiple medias or paths, or for a project to exist in parallel and so on, and how do we suspend our natural tendencies to really find resolution and open that space for creativity. So I wanted to actually provide a few different other sort of representations of this, of this process and so on. I turned to my colleague and friend, Lisa Grocott, who's at Monash University and so on. And so some of the sort of visuals that she created and so on that I think also take a look at that design process in different ways is, kind of somebody who still have the same categories across the bottom and so on, but the kind of like, going, out, coming back in around understanding, creating, as well as delivering and so on, and just recognizing that process. Another representation is this one, and what you see here, of course, is divergent thinking, being able to converge and then keep, kind of keep that sort of iterative, sort of, I have a design challenge, there's this opportunity, and then how do I come up with an innovative solution? Now, part of the reason for this, why this, designer's mindset is really focused on empathy. Empathy, for the people that we are designing for, and, we had, again, the opportunity to have students in the room with us, to help provide some insights into what that student experience is and so on. Empathy is a function, and, I've always liked this quotation from Kwame Dawes, who's a professor at the University of Nebraska and a poet. He talks about empathy as a function of the imagination, that as an artist, as a writer, I have to master empathy. And to do so, I must imagine fully, and imagine with discipline and commitment. The idea that, we need to imagine, what is the experience of students, and really appreciate Kimberly's, talking about, as someone who's gone through the physical, the OT, program at Salt Lake Community College, and, the position that she is now, to try to figure out, like, what do I want to do next? Where do I go, and so on, and it's not just sort of the sort of physical steps and so on, but what does that feel like? And so one strategy I think that has been helpful is this idea of this concept of a journey map. How can we map the journey of those experiences, understand what that student experience is like, and I'd like to just show you a few examples. So this is actually a journey map that was created for Kapiolani Community College in their liberal arts student journey. So down here, you have these boats. Of course, they're located in Hawaii. So recognizing that we may have different pathways for different kinds of students. So here you have, a 4-year boat, or canoe. Someone who might be just exploring, or someone who's just aiming to go get that Kapiolani Community College Associate's degree. They would have to all navigate the exploration shallows and then decide, what their destination is, what is that goal, and so on. They may actually have to kind of circle the fear and the seas of indecision, and then have these different sort of, pathways, whether it's, a pathway to the 4-year college island, or the 2-year degree, and so on, but a different kind of sort of representation to, again, on one hand, help students understand what are the different pathways at Kapiolani, but also, something to be shared externally as a communication tool, but also something that, is intended to reflect an understanding of what that student experience is. The second example is actually one that was created by a graduate student whose goal is I want to get into a UX and program and need a program that will help me grow as a designer as well as a researcher. And what you see here is, like, here are all the different steps. Take the GRE, submit the application, take classes, register, choose summer internship, apply for jobs, graduate, and so on. But what you see here, which is sort of fun, and I think actually, provides some insight into what is that experience like emotionally, right? So take their GRE, not very exciting, orientation, happy face, kind of thing, and so on. So to not forget that kind of dimension, like if you're creating these kinds of, journey maps for your program, your students, and so on, that, it's easy to kind of, map out all the individual steps and so on, but also to consider how your students might be feeling, as they're going through this process. Now, this third example is actually one talking about student onboarding akin to chutes and ladders, and so on. So this idea of, having the early bird applicant, the last minute applicant, and so I think differentiating your different kinds of students, whether they be first-gen students or students that have different kinds of destinations, but to be able to understand what are those different pathways. We've sort of done this with veterans, with more traditional students and so on. What are their kinds of needs and concerns, and what are the things that will help support them, and what are the things that potentially could set them back and so on. So again, to have this visual is helpful not only for perhaps your own planning, but also, as we saw with Kapiolani, could be used as a communication tool as well. Okay, another sort of sort of demonstration of sort of empathy, of course, empathy for the student experience. I'm not going to play this video, but this idea of, creating the, just doing these short interviews. And this was actually a video that was created for largely with the target audience of Stanford faculty and staff, where we have students from our first gen and low income partnership, the FLIP group, actually create this program called What I Wish My Professor Knew, and so on. So a short, video that really provides some insights into what the experience of first gen students, first gen low income students at Stanford is like. And so again, this is just another example of using different kinds of media, different ways of sort of communicating, especially in an age, and also in a time where many people are, it's easy to click on, you watch the video, but you're not going to read the, the 10-page paper, that kind of thing. So really encouraging some exploration of that. Now, the last sort of thing that I want to just briefly sort of mention is this idea of, as we think about like how, I think one thing that has emerged from our conversations today is, this basic concept of verbs, not nouns. Now, when you think about when our students, graduate and they walk across the stage, before, if you ask them like, so please introduce yourself, you might say, hi, I'm Kimberly, I'm a, PTOT student, and so on. But once you walk across that stage and throw that hat in the air and so on, you're not that anymore. You're a graduate and so on, and you're no longer defined by your major and so on. You're defined by what you can do, and that's what people want to know. They want to know what can you do. And so similarly, as we've been discussing here, it's about the skills, it's about the abilities and so on. It's about the competencies and so on. It's not just about the knowledge. I know that Teresa earlier was talking about sort of working with faculty and in content areas and things like that. In this case, with this idea of missions over majors, is this idea of what if students, instead of declaring a major, declared a mission? And how might they use that as a lens to think about their various experiences? So with that, I just want to return to the quote that we started off with. The present moment used to be the unimaginable future. We don't know what's going to happen. There's any number of opportunities and challenges ahead and so on. And, I think this conference really represents that possibility, all the possibilities, the opportunities and possibilities, for those kinds of, for what the various directions and pathways that our future, could hold, especially in this area of portfolios, evidence-based learning, and of course, supporting our students. My parting thought to you is this one, is this idea of, that we aren't trying to just do what we always do. We're not trying to just replicate and, continue along the same path. That, right now you're thinking like, gosh, I have all these ideas and so on. It feels, I'm unsettled. It feels very ambiguous. It's hard. I can't really figure it out and so on. All of this uncertainty and ambiguity and so on. If you're feeling that way, you are exactly in the right place. You're exactly where you should be and so on. Because the whole idea, as we're trying to reach this clarity, is something that's more innovative, something that's more creative, something that's going to be different, and it's going to be better, better for all of us, for our students, for our institutions, and of course for society and the world at large, and so on. So I do applaud all the work, all the great work that we've seen here at this conference, and it's really been my privilege and all of us here at ABLE, to be able to take part in these conversations over the last couple of days. It's, again, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be able to have this conversation with you all, and certainly wish you all the best going forward. Thank you.
Really? It's so clear.
Cheers.
I just want to pick up on your last slide to illustrate our continuing work. Is I looked at that initially, and it came to my mind as a medical thing. That all this activity and stuff, and it's a flat line. And innovation is a flat line. And so we need to keep working on that.
Yeah, maybe we need to kind of do the next iteration of that. It's true. Yeah.
Maybe do a circle.
A circle?
Yeah.
Yeah, and have it just come back around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really what happens.
Yeah.
Because I think 2 years ago when we were in DC,
Yeah.
I saw this,
Yes.
and we were like, maybe there was a feeling of being more on the flat line,
Yeah.
but now we're back in the
Oh, yeah,
crazy
right,
again.
right,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
so-
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that's good. Maybe we should work on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No question. Yeah, I don't know if you have any exemplary examples of portfolios or something that moves beyond like the 6 strategies. Because I kind of want to use those 6 strategies myself. Those are good strategies, but I think sometimes you see like those strategies overlap, which makes it easier for recruiters or employment. But
Right.
sometimes I wonder like about the loss of the holistic picture.
Yeah, and I think, we see the strategies as a starting point, and, and of course the downside of strategies, then people, like a lot of people like the 3 words, and so many of the portfolio, if you look across our portfolio gallery, it's a lot of 3 words and so on. Although ultimately it should be, sometimes they're hybrid and people kind of mix it up and things like that. But I think the idea, what's helpful with the strategy, it's a starting point, and we usually have people work through a worksheet where they try all of them and everything, and then hopefully eventually would come to their own. Eventually it leads to a question about architecture and things like that. How would you structure your portfolio? And so I think sometimes that carries over and everything. But yeah, happy to talk further, and I can probably find some examples and things like that. So yeah.
I was actually just going to say those 6 strategies when we're working with researchers in STEM, it's difficult to get them to find the entry point, and they're so effective, right? For a student who's like, well, I'm in biology and I don't. It's like, well, let's talk about these strategies. At least an emotional place to start.
Right.
Super effective.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So just, and again, I would emphasize it's a starting point. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's that notion of fostering self-awareness and self-reflection about it. And we had a workshop on doing research with portfolios, and I think similarly that those strategies can be helpful for us as researchers in really thinking through who am I as the researcher, what are the questions that I really want to get to, and then how do I formulate my research approaches and methods that align with that, because we all come to our research, I think, based on our own interests and things that we really want to know more about. We want to improve our student learning, we want to foster success, we want to address equity and inclusion issues. Each of us has our own lens that we're seeing our research through, and so I think that transfers also well into the research realm.
Did you?
You've been talking quite a bit about the past, the present, and kind of looking into the future. And so I'm wondering if you kind of see any portfolio strategies or ways of portfolios coming back from the past or things that we haven't actually yet done, or if there are certain areas that we are moving towards right now.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, again, I see, well, the design aspect, I think, is one that, is an area where I think some of the features now of different kinds of portfolio platforms or website building platforms opens up some opportunities, whether it's more integration with other kinds of, whether it be social media or something else, and so on. I mean, I think that's a great question, I think, to kind of pose to the community. In talking with Urmila, she pointed out a couple different things. I mean, we typically differentiate between the learning portfolio and the showcase portfolio, which is probably more process versus product. But her suggestion was that, of course, there's learning everywhere, and so maybe that's not an appropriate sort of descriptor, since there's learning in the showcase portfolio as well. I think. The ideas of multiple portfolios, different portfolios for different audiences, and working with, specifically in the employment context, that, this idea that I got from Jeff Yan is, what if, for someone like, let's say if you're a designer, that you may be tailoring a specific portfolio for a particular position, creating similar to you would tailor like a resume or a cover letter for just, so you can imagine that I'm just going to curate my experience and only highlight those things that are relevant to this particular position that I am applying to. Now that seems like a pretty heavy lift and so on, but it's sort of an interesting sort of idea if it's very easy to be able to, duplicate portfolios and things like that. So I think there's some really interesting trends. I think that, one comment, just building off what Terry had talked about earlier with, the idea of companies and now getting to this idea of credentials and certificates and so on. Where do portfolios live in that space, especially around lifelong learning? Yeah.
Yeah, and just to dovetail with that, I'm thinking back at you mentioned Natasha's presentation yesterday, and I was really fascinated by her showcasing to us like we're constantly chasing employer interests or demands of our students, what they expect of us, and she sort of clearly laid out the notion that maybe they're not so clear on what they want.
Right.
But we look at it and we think, wow, this is what we got to do. And so, just to bring it back to what we're talking about now, there's this learning versus showcase portfolio. I tend to find that we are, and what you just said kind of points in this direction, we are in many ways often looking at the audience, the projected audience for the portfolio, whether it be an employer or a teacher or a badge distributor. And so at that level, even when we're doing learning portfolios, there's often this notion of the audience, which can be good at the level of like learning, because maybe you're engaging with other students, and that would be, I think, a good audience to engage with, because then you reflect together, especially if you can interact on the portfolio. But then, to me, there's also this dimension of ePortfolio use that we haven't really gone into too far, which is a new way, sort of a new technology on which to lay down ideas more personally. So like a new type of notebook, paper, where you can accumulate the sort of the process that you were talking about, having students be able, I've tested this a couple of times with classes where you have students just throw stuff up there, and then go through the process. Eventually, if we get to it, go through the process of synthesizing. Like the different strategies you described, yes, they are somewhat employer-oriented, but it's really about synthesizing ideas and thoughts and sort of presentation of identity. So I'm really excited about the possibility that we could have, and of course, this brings in the digital ethics issue that you brought up too. We could have ePortfolio be the replacement of paper or the replacement of my computer drive, so that you can have it residing somewhere in the cloud, all of the work that you've done, all of your little ideas, and then you can start mixing the personal and the academic a little more actively, so that then when you do sit down to follow the strategy or whatever it is that you're doing to synthesize, it really becomes this much more integrated process. Whereas now, because of platform restrictions, because of cultural trends, we still are digging things up from different places, and hyperlinking or uploading, downloading. And, there's this. I think that the future hopefully would be more in that direction.
I think there's. I mean, I think it's intriguing in terms of reconceiving like what a portfolio could be or where this model might be applicable. I remember having a conversation with Jeff Hannigan about, like, we often talk about scaling up, right? Oh, scalability, more students, more portfolios, and so on. But what about this idea of scaling down? Can we take this portfolio paradigm, and instead of thinking about the big portfolio, like the quarter long or the longitudinal portfolio, or the portfolio for my, gen ed program and so on, what if it's a portfolio just for a project? Instead of students turning in a PowerPoint, that they actually build a portfolio on a much smaller scale for a 2-week project. So what might that look like? Again, same sort of principles apply. We're talking about creating a portfolio, for the conference. Again, it's all the same things around, what is that experience? How do we curate it? What artifacts do we include? How do we provide enough context and reflections to make it all make sense into something that's really coherent and cohesive, for a specific audience and things like that. So I think there are opportunities to kind of play around with that as well.
I guess my question sort of builds on that, because I'm always wondering where the room is for, sort of someone who's more like me, who's in general just sort of a faculty member looking at my own classes, to sort of participate in places like AAEEBL and in the research where realistically the research I kind of want to do isn't like a large scale, how is this working across the campus. This is not where my interests or abilities lie. But I love like small scale. I love hearing professors talk about or reading articles about how it's worked in their classroom. And a lot of my best ideas from very different disciplines have come through that. So I'm just wondering where you sort of think the goal is for that.
I think definitely, I mean, even in our research sort of conversation with Tracy and Eddie and so on, and that it isn't, not everyone's aiming to put an article into an international journal of ePortfolio, and that's okay. I think it's a lot of the same methods around, quantitative, qualitative surveys, interviews, mixed methods, research, and so on, or even like looking at portfolios themselves, but for a different purpose and a different audience. And that might just be evaluation, improvement, of the class, and help inform decisions about the next time I teach this class, or even just the next lecture I give, and so on. How could that be helpful? And so I think we are also trying to carve out a space, for that really for the focused on the practitioners. How can we, what are things that we can glean and, provide a sort of stronger community to support exactly people like you. So I think that definitely is an interest.
Because I would argue that, going back to your point about scaling up, would get us away from the obsession with numbers and quantity and statistics, and really get back to a qualitative element of development. Which, because I remember a few years ago, a decade ago, when I first got into the portfolio, I was being told by a sister institution here in CUNY that they had, there was 25,000 portfolios at that time. And my first reaction was like, wow. And then my second question was like, oh, can I look at them all? Because I want to see, with my own experience here now at the college, we know that there are a lot of empty portfolios sitting there. I feel bad about it.
Well, I think what you both are pointing to maybe is that a set of rich case studies that reflect the different spaces in which ePortfolios are used and the kinds of evidence that they're generating and how we might use that in our own context would be really useful. Is that what you were? Yeah. So
there's an institutional, we talk a lot about the institutional role, how we fit into the institutional expectations of us using the portfolios. And that takes away from what Kate is talking about, this sort of, if I really want to be committed to this, if I want to have buy-in, a problematic concept of buy-in, but if we really want to buy into using this, we have to make it our own, just like we do with the students, right? They have to feel authorship and ownership. Faculty and even the sort of staff, I think that at all levels, even though there's the institutional desire to make a program work for a certain reason, and then of course there's the big assessment things around it, the notion of individual connections and value-added integration, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Right.
And I don't think there's an inherent, there may be some tension, but they work together. You need the people on the ground feeling supported, and then they're going to be able to work better. Institution, organization is going to work.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys so much.